Hi, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to start our in-depth exploration of the ego tunnel by Thomas Metzingers. We're going to start with the introduction, which is actually quite dense. And I just quickly wanted to say how I'm going about this. So basically, when I read a book like that, I mean, granted that this is a popular philosophy book, so it's geared towards an audience that isn't trained in philosophy. Nevertheless, it's quite dense and you have to pay attention. So what I do is, when I read through the book, I make sure that I, really mark each and every argument after the other. So I do this by indicating H for hypothesis, because I treat the content as basically hypotheses. It's not proven, it's something that the author puts out, so it's up to you to decide whether you think this is congruent or not. So you want to list really the argument, at least that's how I go about it. So I put together a total of 33 hypotheses from this introduction, and I then proceeded to cluster those into themes, and I came up with 11 themes around which I was able to cluster those hypotheses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually prompt all these hypotheses for you. You can take screen grabs if you want, so you can follow along. And I will also introduce the main theorem of the book in terms of a drawing to make it more easy to understand. It's easier to, when you have a drawing or a visualization, to follow, what the basic theorem or argument is of such a book. And it'll also be able, it'll also help us, because we can always revisit the drawing later on in the video series. So let me start out with the main theorem of the book, which is called the Phenomenal Self Model, or PSM. Metzingers basically draws the following picture. If you look at the top of the drawing, you see that we have sensory data, which I indicated here with the icon or the symbol of a mountain range. The sensory data enters your sensory organs. Now, this isn't a complete list of your sensory organs, because you also have taste and whatnot. So you have your sensory apparatus. Your sensory apparatus does filter the information that is coming in the sensory data. That's just what the sensory organs do. So after the data was filtered, it is being processed by your brain, or more globally expressed by your nervous system. Now, when that processing happens, Metzingers proposes that the content you are processing both creates a representation of the world, which is indicated here by another icon of the mountain. It's a representation, it's not the real mountain, which is quite important. And also your nervous system creates a sense of I-ness, or what he calls a point of view at the same time. So that is roughly what happens, and what is being subsumed under the name Phenomenal Self Model. Furthermore, if we introduce the aspect of time, you can see that your nervous system produces, a set of representations of both the world and a sense of I-ness over time. It does it repeatedly, time after moment after moment after moment. So essentially that is what he calls the, that is what he coins the ego tunnel. So basically the portion where you will have content that points to your sense of I-ness or your point of view over the course of time. That is what he means by ego tunnel. So now that we have a clear picture of what the central theorem, this PSM model, is, let's move to the main argument of at least this introductory chapter. In my view, the main argument consists of three consecutive hypotheses, and that is, there is no thing, no indivisible entity that is us, neither in the brain, which we can treat as second hypothesis, nor in some metaphysical realm, which we could clearly have to treat as a third hypothesis. And those three hypotheses taken together is, in my opinion, the main argument that he makes in this introduction. As we saw in our drawing, in our visualization of the PSM model, what we can say is that the content of the phenomenal self model seems to be the ego, or we can equate the content of that, the content of that tunnel with the ego. And we probably would have to be more precise and say the part where we create an idea of I-ness or point of view, that really, those little mannequins spread over time, that's the portion that he would equate with ego. So what does this mean? It means that Metzinger basically proposes that our sense of self is a product of ongoing neural processes, and that it's the processes that are ongoing that create a coherent or unified sense of being an individual with and having a unique perspective on the world. In terms of the function of the ego, he says, and I will prompt you three more hypotheses here. He says that the PSM, which is short for the phenomenal self model, allows a biological organism to continuously conceive of itself and others as a whole. It enables the organism to interact with its internal world as well as with the external environment in an intelligent and holistic manner. The ego is a tool for controlling and planning your behavior and for understanding the behavior of others. I think, this is an important question, is why would nature, even create such an ego tunnel? Why would we have to have a point of view? Why would we have to have a sense of individuality, of wholeness, vis-a-vis, the context in which we move in? So he answers this question by this set of statements, and he's not contradicting basic psychological knowledge with that, because, for instance, I was trained in the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung. Carl Gustav Jung makes a similar claim. He says that the ego pretty much is your conduit for interaction with the world. So it both gives you control over your conscious mental content, but it also lets you negotiate with the external world. as indicated here, I found one hypothesis that goes further into this topic. So it says the ego and the tunnel are evolved representational phenomena as a result of dynamical self-organization on many levels. Now, if you compare this statement with Embodied Mind, it's a book that we covered. It's a book by Francisco Varela. I'm going to try and link it up here somewhere in this video. So if you haven't seen it, you can go back and watch it. So we can basically compare this claim that he makes here with the content of embodiment. And also there is a concept of autopoiesis, which is a Greek term for self-creation. So basic thought is that nature has a tendency, once it develops, nervous systems as complex as the human nervous systems, including brains, that those nervous systems have a tendency to self-create a image of a self, a image of a point of view. So, and we can subsume this under the topics of emergentism or cognitivism. So that's roughly what he means by dynamical self-organization. I was able to identify two hypotheses that are relevant for this topic. So the first one is the conscious experience is the ego tunnel. And the second one, the ongoing process of conscious experience is not so much an image of reality as a tunnel through reality. If you remember the visualization that we showed in the beginning, it's basically just reiterating that there is a factor of time, that there is a multiplication of these singular representations that are created in our nervous system of both ourselves and of an external world, and that these representations are happening over the course of time. So basically that's why we can talk about a tunnel, It's the content of our conscious experience is an internal construct. The internal image of the person as a whole is the phenomenal ego, the I, or self as it appears in conscious experience. And lastly, conscious experience is exclusively internal. Now, I'm highlighting these statements as separate statements, even though four of them are, three of them, sorry, are actually one sentence taken together. But I do have contention with him equating ego with self, because I'm trained in the psychology of C.G. Jung, and according to C.G. Jung there's a difference between the ego and the self. So I just wanted to point that out. We have to ask ourselves if the brain is a necessary or just a sufficient condition of this model. So I was able to find two statements with regards to the role of the brain. First of all, phenomenal content is determined locally, not by the environment at all, but by internal properties of the brain only. We can artificially activate the minimal neural correlate of a given conscious experience, and you get the conscious experience itself. Now, basically, he claims that the brain is a necessary condition for the PSM model. Without a brain, and I think that we mentioned that in the last video, without a brain, there, according to Metzinger, there is no such thing as consciousness. And even if we extended the brain to include the rest of the nervous system, you know, in a human body, that still is a very strong claim. And it says pretty much you have to have a brain in an organism in order to have consciousness. So that's, again, that's his opinion. I found a total of 6 statements concerned with the topic of limitation. So the first one is, what we experience is only a small fraction and an extremely selective way of representing information of what actually exists out there. It was important for me to dissect this one sentence into 3 statements. I can concur with the first statement that what we perceive is only a small fraction. I think that's a no-brainer. We know that our sensory faculties that do the filtering are filters. So only a portion of the available information will arrive in our processing unit, so to speak. And an extremely selective way of representing information. I think it's worth taking this as a separate statement, because the argument of selection is an important one when you look at evolution. We will see that later. And of what actually exists out there, why is that a separate statement? Well, it's a claim that there is a world that exists separately from what your brain is doing in terms of, creating representations, which is, you can have this opinion or you can have a different opinion, which is why it's important to, mark that as a separate statement. Also, our sensory organs are limited. That's somewhat of a repetition. We constantly apply unconscious filter mechanisms, and in doing so, we unknowingly construct our own internal world or world model, which is our reality tunnel. I found it important to mark this as a statement because it contains the argument that there is unconscious filtering going on, which I think is quite an important statement. So if you look at human beings, the consequence of this statement would be that, the filtering is not in your control, which is both obvious but also a hard pill to swallow, and it's important to be conscious of the fact that this is happening for a lot of reasons that we will probably get to later on in the book, such as free will and stuff like that. The filtering mechanisms are our sensory systems and our brain. I think I mentioned that before. This is just proof that he really believes this is so. I already alluded to this aspect when we talked about the aspect of selection of information, the filtering that's going on. So he says they evolved for reasons of survival, and by they, he's referring to the sensory organs that are limited. We need to treat this as a separate hypothesis because it's a parallel to, I found, with Donald Hoffman's work. If you don't know Donald Hoffman, you should Google him. I think I linked posts in the community tab sometime going back. I'm not sure if I deleted them in the meantime, but basically Donald Hoffman makes a similar claim, is that the reason why we are only taking in a limited amount of information is so that we can actually survive and evolve. If we were to take in all the information that's actually available, you know, we pretty much wouldn't be able to evolve as a species. So, and that's an interesting aspect, by the way, a little side note, if you think about autism, you know, which obviously I'm thinking about because I am autistic. And the reason, my reason for reading this book actually is to find out what exactly is happening with autistic people in terms of, you know, developing a sense of ego. I think there are clear differences between autistic people and neurotypical people in terms of developing the ego or having the capacity to develop an ego. But that is my own spiel that I'm sort of researching at the moment, so never mind. We have the following statements. By placing the self model within the world model, a center is created. We possess an integrated inner image of ourselves that is firmly anchored in our feelings and bodily sensations. The world simulation created by our brains includes the experience of a point of view. I think it's a bit of an amalgamation of arguments here. I would read it as, you know, that's why I'm coining this codependent or codependent arising. I'm hoping I'm not putting words in his mouth, but I feel that what he's saying is that it's sort of like there's a dependent relationship. In order for your nervous system to create a representation of a world, it seems that it needs to, at the same time, create a point of view, some kind of point of view, you know. And I think that's what's being conveyed here, is that there is a sort of codependence between creating that point of view and a representation of the world, really. So if you have a point of view, there needs to be context to this point of view. Next up, we have transparency. I think we mentioned that in the last video that I did. It's one of the central points of his theorem, is that there is transparency, and basically what he means by that is the conscious experience of being a self emerges because a large part of the PSM in our brain is transparent. It can become the ego only because you are constitutionally unable to realize that all this is just the content of a simulation in your brain. So what does that mean? It means in order for, we go back to necessary or sufficient condition here, and basically what he says is that in order for you to even be able to, let's be honest, be fooled to have an ego, is there needs to be transparency. So the minute, let's put it, think about it the other way around. So the minute you become aware of it being just a construct, the ego itself becomes weakened. So the ego can only be upheld if you're being clueless about what's happening, what's actually happening. The minute you become aware of what is happening, you know, of how your nervous system, how your brain is processing information, how it is creating this image of an eye, the minute you become aware of this, this very projection, this very creation becomes weakened. So what he terms transparency is basically this ignorance. So if this is a transparent process, or it is necessary for this to be a transparent process in order for you to adhere to this idea of ego. I hope that makes it clear. There is an outside world, there is an objective reality, and we are never directly in touch with reality as such, because the filters prevent us from seeing the world as it is. If you go back to the visualization that we looked at in the very beginning, if you look at all the steps that are needed for you to create or for your nervous system to create a representation of an actual world out there, you clearly see that there is a distinction between the sensory data that is available and what arrives in your nervous system or in your brain. So by the very fact that only a portion of the information arrives in your brain, we have a difference there. Hence, we can safely say that what is being constructed in our brains is not congruent with what's actually out there. It's really interesting to visit information about how other types of organisms conceive of, the world, or the world that we conceive of. If you compare and contrast, you'll be amazed. And I'm actually going to link a video. I hope I can find it. I think it's a video that compares both sight and sound of, for instance, bees and dogs and cats, and how they sort of see the world, and also how they hear, if hearing is available to these organisms. And it's actually quite astounding, the differences. I think I can include my 3 contentions that I had in this video, because we actually were good on time. So I'm going to include them. My first contention I already mentioned is that Metzinger equates ego with self. I'm going to read you a short paragraph clearing this up. So Carl Gustav Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, did make a distinction between the ego and the self. In Jungian psychology, the ego represents the conscious mind, the sense of personal identity and individuality. It is the part of the psyche that is responsible for mediating between the external world and the inner world of the unconscious. On the other hand, the self in Jungian psychology is the unification of the conscious and unconscious aspects of the personality. It represents the totality of the psyche, including both the conscious ego and the deeper unconscious aspects of the individual. The self is associated with the process of individuation, which involves the integration of all aspects of the psyche to achieve wholeness and self-realization. In summary, Jung saw the ego as the conscious part of the psyche, responsible for personal identity, while the self represents the broader, deeper and more unified sense of the whole personality. So I feel it would have been important to make that distinction. My second contention is with a statement that I actually haven't prompted yet. It's the statement, a biological organism as such is not a self. I found that it kind of runs counter to his other claims. Basically, the claim that, I can see why he makes the statement. He probably wants to make sure he has a way to distinguish between humans with a very developed, nervous system and other types of organisms, and, the claim of whether, for instance, dogs can be conscious or plants, for instance. So I can see why he makes that statement, but if I understand him correctly, he by distinguishing sort of the biological organism from the concept of self, he underscores the need to consider psychological and cognitive factors in understanding selfhood. And I haven't seen him make these arguments yet in this introductory chapter. So at this point in the book, I cannot see how he would elaborate on this distinction, but maybe he'll come to this later in the book. So let's be fair, but maybe let's just put a pin in that. Thirdly, I contend the statement, the problem of consciousness is all about subjective experience, about the structure of our inner life, and not about knowledge of the outer world. I mean, aside from my contending this, all of this stuff anyway, because I do follow a different philosophy, I contend the statement just, you know, because he sort of contradicts himself, really. And we might go back to the visualization and the fact that, you know, when the nervous system does the processing, it always creates both a point of view but also a representation of a external world. This goes back to this codependent arising argument. So to claim that, you know, a knowledge of the external world, which I guess could be equated with the representation of a external world. So I guess he contradicts himself if he says that, you know, the problem of consciousness is all about subjective experience. That's just doesn't make sense to me personally at this point. Right, so that was it. That was the introduction. I hope you were able to follow. I hope this, you know, helps you when you think about reading a book like this in the future. Maybe you can sort of adopt this style of mine if you wish. And I will see you in my next video. Bye.